So I recently did a video on the new Proto-Martyr album, and in that video I talked about the relatively rare sensation of being into a band that's currently doing its best work, right? A band that is right now in its prime. Because of the types of things that I listen to, most of the bands I love have broken up or gone on a quiet but indefinite hiatus, or they've had their most significant members die, or, they've just stopped figuring out how to make good music, or they've gone into the phase of their career where they are starting to release music that is advertised as a return to form while in fact being a shadow of their best work. In the case of Yes, maybe all of the above. Because basically we're at a point in history where most of the artists who are ever going to make great music probably have already made and stopped making that great music. And that awareness, of getting to be into a band that is currently in its prime will probably become more and more common as the bulk of people's attention, even the attention of very young people, gradually shifts toward older music. Now, this is a phenomenon that's been talked about a lot in a few different places, including past videos of mine, but I do think it's a thing that is happening and will continue to happen. It's very odd to me to still sometimes hear people say things like, "Oh, I can't believe you know that song. It was popular 20 years before you were born," because that's not really a standard that still describes anybody's experience with or understanding of music, at least anybody that I'm aware of. So the question then becomes, who's better off, right? The people who were 20 when Close to the Edge came out, for instance, and, got to see him on that tour, or, a generation later, the people who saw, Metallica on the Master of Puppets tour, who got to see Nirvana in 1991. Those people, on the one hand, or the people who are 20 now, or 40, in my case, right, who came along after that history was made, came along after those tours were over, came along after the significance of those things had been established, and for the most part, those bands had either disappeared or started sucking, and who just had the albums and the photos and kind of the whole thing in a retrospect. I think most people would expect that I would say the first group, right? The first group are the luckier ones. The first group are better off. And that's probably even most people's default answer. But I'm actually going to make a case here for why I think the second group maybe has the advantage. So I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock project that mixes aspects of progressive rock, post-rock, and post-punk. You can check out our album playlists here on YouTube, or look us up on your favorite streaming service, or, of course, good old Bandcamp. So I should start out here with a confession, which is that I have stopped being jealous of people who lived through the most fertile and well-regarded periods of my favorite bands. There's a particular ritual that I did for a long time where, you meet somebody at, let's say, the Steve Hackett Seconds Out show, right? And you talk about bands that you like, and he'll say that he saw Camel on the Moon Madness tour. And, as a millennial prog rock fan, you are kind of obligated to ooh and ah and make the necessary obeisance and express jealousy for having been born at the right time to have that privilege. Perhaps this is a rude metaphor, but, it's a little bit like being circumcised and having somebody go on at great length about how great it is to have a foreskin. Doesn't do me a lot of good. But I'm old enough now, I think, and experienced enough to understand that the memory of having seen a great band 20 or 30 years ago doesn't mean as much or do as much for you as you might think. I might have missed most of the giants, but I don't know. I saw Nick Cave on the No More Shall We Part tour. I saw Opeth and Porcupine Tree play together, promoting In Absentia and Damnation. I saw Radiohead touring for Kid A. In every case, that's maybe not the absolute most ideal tour for that band if you could pick anything ever, but it is a highly respected live act, touring during a period where they're releasing some of what, in retrospect, has become their best regarded material. And most of my memories of those nights don't really even have that much to do with the music. I think about the Nick Cave show, and I think about being stuck in a snowstorm on the way home. I think about the Opeth show, and I think about my girlfriend at the time getting very mad because it took too long between sets for them to switch over between bands. I think of the Radiohead show, and I mostly just think about hanging out with my mom at a giant amphitheater while some tiny little Englishmen made a sort of vaguely discernible sound hundreds of feet away. Now, it's pretty cool in the abstract to say that I saw those shows, but the actual memory of absorbing that music in the moment is hazy, and it's been to a great extent overwritten by live albums, by shows on YouTube, by the general reputation of that artist. I sort of didn't have a great time at that Nick Cave show, and I remember being disappointed by it, but I spent the next 20 years hearing that Nick Cave is an electrifying live performer. I went to other Nick Cave shows that I did think were fantastic and I enjoyed a lot. I can actually look up a pretty well shot video of the show that I was at on YouTube, and it seems like a pretty good show. So it's been overwritten in my memory as a great show, even though that's not really the feeling that I had leaving the venue, which kind of leaves the question, what was necessarily the point of having been there? Concerts are often frustrating experiences. You're sitting next to this giant wall of sound. It's not clear what to make of it in the moment. If you're not sitting in just the right place in the venue, then your kind of sonic balance might not be that great. You're often drunk or high. And I think the idea that this or that band was a life-changing, transcendent experience in this or that year is a mythology, really, that gets built in retrospect much more often than it's an experience that is had in real time. I like saying I saw Radiohead tour for Kid A, but you could delete that experience from my life and the loss wouldn't really be that great. And I'm a very nostalgic person, right? I treasure detailed memories of all sorts of moments in my life that were profoundly moving or exciting or transformative. And, concerts rarely are in that echelon. To be clear, I have had incredibly good times at shows, but it was often either bands I didn't like or bands that weren't really in their prime. Probably the most fun I've ever had in my whole life at a concert was a Korean rockabilly band called the Rock Tigers, whose albums I would never in a million years think to seek out. I saw Monster Magnet in a tiny club in the late 2010s and had an absolute blast. It was a brilliant show, wonderful time, even though their best work was way behind them at that point and they were commercially totally irrelevant. There's almost always an inverse relationship between the size of the venue and the amount of fun you're going to have at the show. And a lot of the time I've had actually a better experience seeing a nothing band or a washed up band in a tiny, tiny venue than I have seeing a really well-regarded band in its prime at, a theater or an amphitheater. And seeing a band that you know is great or a band that you know is one of your favorites, in a strange way, it can be kind of a drag, right? Because it comes with the particular psychological burden where you feel the pressure to be moved or excited by that experience in the moment. You're constantly comparing the reality to the expectation. The point here is that I'm not actually convinced that seeing a great band in their prime playing what will 20 or 30 years later be regarded as a legendary set is actually that wonderful experience, other than for bragging rights and an abstract sort of satisfaction. Particularly since, the reason that we know these were great for the most part is because there is really good documentation. There are good live albums. There are videos. There's ways to get some sense of what the experience was in a way that's maybe actually clearer than if you were sitting there in the audience that night. Now, a lot of people who have the benefit of having gone to, a King Crimson show in 1974 might be disagreeing with me here. But, I wonder if they're at least a little bit lying to themselves. You may think I'm wrong, or you may think I just have not ever been to the right show, but look deep inside yourself and see if maybe I have a point. So conversely, what are the advantages of being a new fan of old music, right? Being someone who was late to the party? Well, there are lots of small things that you can probably guess, right? That are so obvious I don't really even necessarily need to say them here. It's much easier to access the music, particularly things like B-sides, outtakes. The history of the making of it is more available. You can more readily access details about how that work was created. I think that's a paradox, actually, because the further that we get in time from the work, somehow the more accessible it becomes. Now, to some extent, that's probably a result of technological change that I've bemoaned elsewhere, right? But as someone who tried to find all the Genesis B-sides before the internet existed, it's a lot easier now. But there's one particular aspect that I think really doesn't get talked about enough, which is that it's easier to be philosophical about the arc of a band's career and to appreciate the fullness of the body of work and to find the good aspects of weak or subprime releases, and just generally to avoid being a dick about the whole thing if you come to it all after the fact. You know, in my mind, I mentioned Metallica earlier, right? And seeing them on the Master of Puppets tour, which I did not do because I was 2. And in my mind, as somebody who came to that music much later, Metallica have always been a band that cut their hair and started making short, radio-friendly pop rock songs. I know my personality well enough to know that if I had been a fan in 1991 when the Black Album came out, I'd have been furious. But in my world, in my experience of how things are, they've just always been a band that turned into that, right? That arc is just part of the idea of Metallica. And more than that, you know, I also have the historical perspective to understand that none of the classic thrash bands kept playing great music in that style forever, right? You know, they turned into groove metal like Anthrax, or they started playing a stale version of the same sound like Slayer, or they turned into the worst radio rock band imaginable like Megadeth. An example that might be more familiar to most of my viewers: I don't mind that Genesis simplified their sound and became megastars. It's just part of the story of Genesis as I've always understood it. Now, certainly I like some things more than others, but the fact that Genesis turned into a pop band is like, I don't know, being mad about that is like being mad that fall comes after summer. But if I'd been somebody who saw the Lamb tour in 1974, I probably would have thought that Invisible Touch was the most infuriating piece of garbage in the world. I know that about myself. I know that I react to those things that way. But as things are, you know, because I've come with the benefit of hindsight, with the understanding of what things inevitably would be, it's easy for me to enjoy a few songs off Load and Reload. It's easy for me to hear some positive things about Invisible Touch, and I'm not angry those things exist. And again, you know, having spent a certain amount of time on the internet and seen the way people talk about music, the people who are really adversarial about the relationship between the new and old versions of these things, right? The people who are really nasty about Abacab era Genesis, or the people who still can't let go of the idea that Metallica, you know, haven't been good since 1990. Those are pretty much always people who are of an age where they were there to see that change happen, right? And the younger fans are pretty much always the ones who are more reasonable about that transition and more willing to take the whole history of the band in a fair-minded way. You know, I think about my relationship to newer bands, and I can see an inverse of this, right? I was very sad when the band Grizzly Bear retired, right? I thought they were a brilliant band. They made 5 albums of great music, and if I'd become a Grizzly Bear fan in 2035, when it was established for 20 years that there would just always ever be 5 Grizzly Bear albums, I wouldn't have had that same sense of sadness. I loved the first 3 Arcade Fire albums. The Suburbs in particular seemed to me like one of the best concept albums of its decade and a total revitalization and redemption of the idea of conceptual rock. And then they did sort of a Calypso album with some cool songs, but some pretty meh stuff and some awkward bits. And then they did this just dreadful indie disco album that I basically threw out the car window, which I almost never do. And I found all that incredibly disappointing. Totally aside from Win Butler's personal issues, it's just been infuriating to see the arc of their career in real time, where they go from being one of the best art rock bands of my whole adulthood to kind of like a pretentious version of Vampire Weekend. Now, if I'd become an Arcade Fire fan years after that happened, when it was well established that they were going to fall off a cliff, I'd probably be a lot chiller about it. I might be more willing to listen to the new album. Now, would it be healthier to just be chill about this stuff anyway? I mean, yeah, sure. All right, so those are my thoughts about some of the benefits and drawbacks of being an older or newer music fan. Hope that wasn't too self-absorbed. Hope that wasn't too anecdotally based. I think most of the behaviors that I'm talking about I have observed in people around me, but they're not necessarily things that you can track statistically. Thank you very much for your attention. Likes, subscribes, comments, all helpful. Hope everybody has a good week, and I will talk to you soon.